The topic for this decan is Olalon, the second person of the Trinity. Olalon has 6 attributes, just like Hawk, the first person of the Trinity. The attributes are will, creation, revelation, grace, mercy, and incarnation. Now, a word about the basic idea of what Olalon is. She is associated with identity as opposed to difference, and with reflection as opposed to being. And the idea, more or less, is that as a result of God's perfection, as a result of Hawk's perspective, perfection, generally speaking, there's too much. There's like a surplus or a contradiction. And as a result, God folds back onto himself and observes himself. It's like there's a problem that arises within God. And so God has to, for the first time, look back and view himself. And he does it through the eyes of Olalon. And the basic drive of Olalon is to solve things. So Hawk has nothing to solve. Hawk just is magnificent, is being. And then as a result of that going too far or something, Olalon emerges. Now, from a Christian perspective, what I've just said sounds like heresy because it implies that God has a problem, that there's something wrong with God, which would mean that God is not perfect after all. And this brings me to the sort of technique, I guess, of using antinomies in talking about the absolute rather than like theses or categories, because the way I've put it, it definitely is heretical. And you know, but you find this is the God of Schelling or the God of Hegel, who have a Gnostic attitude towards the divine, and for them, God is this evolving thing and is not really like an all-powerful thing, because it's like philosophy can sort of know God in a way. For each of Olalon's attributes then, and remember, identity is not an attribute, that is her substance or her essence, I'm going to describe the attribute as an antinomy between a heretical view of what the attribute means and a dogmatic one. The last note before I start is just that dogma kind of gets a bad name, or it has a bad name. You know, it's like, oh, dogma, that's bad or stupid. And all I'll say about the idea of dogma is that, a dogma for the church is a message that God chose to give humans. And so no reasoning can arrive at the dogma. It's not something logically true. No study or fact or anything like that can empirically derive the dogma. There's nothing like intellectually like tidy or elegant about a dogma. Like, it's just a message from God. And the thing is that a rigorous philosophy that is also humble leaves room for messages from God. It's a philosophical choice rooted in, I think, like kind of prejudice and shame and maybe even capitalist ideology, that like it's stupid to think that there could just be a God that gives messages to the world. It's not true. No one ever proved that can't happen. So Olalon's will is the will to create / redeem the world, the will to create a perfect world. And the dogmatic version of this is that the will is a joyful will, and that God didn't need to create the world, but just wanted to. The more heretical Gnostic view would be that because something was wrong with God, God had to pursue this sort of healing journey because of a trauma that God actually experienced. Flowing from the will, God then is the creator. So God creates the world, and the creation process sort of has like subcategories. There's creation, and then the fall of humanity, which is a free act that was acted by humans, and then redemption, and then apocalypse, where the world is redeemed, and then the world either arrives at a final state of bliss or resolves back into God. And so that whole process is part of creation, but not all of it is God. Like once the fall takes place, like God doesn't fall. That's man. So, and the heretical version is that God, has to create. Basically, the relationship to nothingness is the variable in heresy versus dogma. Dogmatic version, God creates from nothing. Like that's a really important point, that there's this nothingness that is there, causing God to create. And it seems like it makes more sense that the nothingness would be upsetting to God, like that it would be God's version of the existential void that humans feel. So that that kind of makes a lot of sense to me. And there are, Jacob Boehm is an example of a Christian who does believe that. So that, and Protestantism kind of has this, but the official position is that the nothingness is just there, and that it's like something out of which God creates joyfully. So revelation is God's capacity to give messages to humans that are prayerful. And with this, it's kind of easier to distinguish between humanist versus religious, I guess, in the dogmatic versus heretical view. A humanist will think of this in terms of various modes of genius. Artistic revelation. A poetic gift, an artistic gift, or mathematical, scientific genius, or just really important moments where a powerful figure comes in and kind of does something good or does something bad. A lot of dogmatic Christian theology, part of like the effort, especially in modern times, is to distinguish those modes of revelation, which are arguably spiritual, but maybe not from God, from pure revelation, which would just be religious. Like it would just be like messages from God that are good, and that like scientific discoveries don't count. Also, in it's kind of a leap already to some people to think of those humanist modes of inspiration as a revelation from God. But the point is that once you see the commonality between those things, then there's actually still a difference. And I'm not sure exactly how that all hangs together. Also, if you leave out art and science, among religious people, like witchy people and occultists, use magic. And that is a mode of revelation where you're kind of carrying out your will through divine inspiration or making contact with demonic forces that might not actually be God. And from the Christian perspective, that's like making a deal with the devil. And again, I'm not totally clear on like where I stand, but that's kind of a survey of revelation. So grace is God not just inspiring you from the inside, but then God causing events to take place in the outside that are a gift. And with this, there's not such a strong heresy dogma divide. When on the one hand, there's grace that's more like, okay, I've chosen to live in faith, and I've made my pact with God to follow the voice of inspiration, through my fears, and then as a result, God rewards me by sort of causing something, like causing the outcome that I was seeking to emerge in an unlikely way, and it's kind of synchronistic and magical. So that's one mode that's definitely, if not heretical, is more sort of self-oriented. Then there's also a form of grace where the idea is that you learn to take joy in something that you never thought would cause you joy. So it's like a grace out of nowhere, that has nothing to do with your will or plan, and it's actually better than anything you could ever want. And that's just like the grace of contact with God. Like, the grace involved in seeing how amazing it actually feels to like just breathe, if you truly meditate, and so forth. Another point to make about grace is that the idea in at least certain theological views is that when you attain a state of grace, your own mind and your own desires become like an instrument of a divine mind. So like literally, it's like your mind is now a limb or a body or an assemblage, and there's something else that's working through you because you've established contact with it. And I think that's kind of an elegant thought, and I've had experiences like that. It's hard to know what to make of them, but especially in artistic creation, there's like a sense of like, you're like, oh, I don't even know why I'm doing this exactly, but I feel compelled to. And then like, the period at the end of the sentence comes, and then suddenly the whole sentence makes sense in a way that it didn't when you were only halfway through the sentence. So that's part of grace as well. Mercy is God's capacity to forgive and heal anything. I originally called this forgiveness, but I wanted to change its name to mercy to underscore that it's not just about forgiving my sins, it's also about forgiving, like my ability to forgive traumatic things that have taken place, or people who instigated them. And one can have a mindset that it's impossible, like that everything is ruined, everything is doomed, there was some mistake that was made or some thing that shouldn't have been done that causes just desolation. And it's God that comes in and brings in this light of forgiveness and opens up new horizons. And often that includes sort of a perspective from which the traumatic thing or the horrible mistake turns out to now seem like a gift and an asset, and it was just painful at the time, but it was actually necessary. That's something people say, something I've felt and said in certain contexts. Again, this is a mystery, so I don't really understand it, and it doesn't quite make sense to me. Finally, we have incarnation. So the non-Christian view of incarnation, let's say the Sino-Vedic view, and I think there's no really secular version of this that I can think of right now anyway, but in Hinduism and Buddhism and religions sort of that nexus, there's the idea of Buddhas who are people who they're human beings who attain God consciousness, and they're able to share the message with others. And sometimes there are people who may even reach enlightenment so that they wouldn't need to be reincarnated, but then they choose to be reincarnated. And in their next life, they're not going to realize that they're the same person for the first half of their life, but then they'll kind of get re-clued in and then continue on what's called the bodhisattva path. And there are also avatars where a god simply descends and takes on human form. And in Christianity, there's a lot of that too, the avatar of angels. I mean, sometimes God appears, or at least Mary appears. Mary is a big appearer, in Catholicism. And there's not so much a tradition of people attaining enlightenment because humility is such an important part of Christianity. But anyway, in the Christian view, there was only one incarnation, and that was the incarnation of Jesus. And so Jesus was both a Buddha and an avatar. I'm getting that formulation from a book called Meditations on the Tarot by Tomberg, which is the best book in the world. And I think that's a great way of putting it, basically, that that Jesus is the incarnation, which means that he's both a Buddha and an avatar. Now, speaking of Jesus, I should probably address the name Olalon and the connection or lack thereof between the second person of the Trinity in this system, Olalon, and other trinities, especially the Christian Trinity. So Jesus is usually considered to be the second person in Christianity. And Mary is not part of the Trinity at all, but she, especially in Catholicism in the last century, or the last millennium or so, and even especially last century, actually, Mary is really growing in importance for Catholics. She was immaculately conceived, but is not considered to be part of the Godhead. But she's crowned in heaven after she ascended into heaven. So she's, quite divine. The way I sort of, see it here is that the second person of the Trinity is both Mary and Jesus, and it sort of starts out more Mary-like with the will and the creation and her sort of giving birth to the world. And there's like a gradation from like Mary essence to Jesus essence by the time that you arrive at incarnation. So it's like Mary, because Mary, So I should probably clarify this because it's maybe not that well known, but Mary was also born without sin, and uh, that notion is a more recent one in Catholicism, but it's like uh, Mary's a big deal. There's also the sort of Platonic or Neoplatonic conception of like the second part of the Godhead being the world of forms, right? So it's like all of the categories of things that there are in God's mind. So the second person of the Trinity is like not God's unitary nature, but God's thoughts, and God's thoughts are then instantiated. He has the thought of like a chair, and then there's all these chairs, and they're in the world. And in a more modern context, that those would be genes, like genomes, genomes in nature, or maybe computer programs. Um, uh, so this gets back to the idea of the second person of the Trinity as reflection, which has, reflection means a reflection, but it also means thinking. That, as Hegel says, history is God's mind. And so when cultural events take place and, theories and artworks are created and, important things happen in the world, God stores all that in her mind, I guess, or his mind, which is her or whatever. So there's this remembering dimension to Olalon. And it's also Olalon who sort of remembers our divine nature, which we're often closed off to. So that pretty much concludes the topic of Olalon.